The internet was central to the mass protest after the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. In the middle of a pandemic, people organized, coordinated, and educated themselves online. Police brutality is not new, but neither was this digital mobilization. 28 years earlier, in May 1992, "No justice, no peace" was sounding in the streets of LA and online. My name is Suzanne van Geuns, and this is Does Not Compute, a toolbox for humanists who want to understand public conversations. I'm here to tell you that we don't need to exchange our historical methods for programming skills. We just need to know how to treat the web as an archive. In this video, I will show you how to do that for the decade of boom before the dot-com bust, the 1990s. By the late 1980s, the computer revolution was well underway. Every group and organization had a network. The military, universities, hobbyists, and online services, which were corporations that sold subscriptions to their networks. In the 1990s, these different networks began assembling into one giant internetwork domain. By developing shared protocols and standards, it became possible to smoothly connect two networks, even if they were very different in design. To navigate this internetwork, or internet for short, new tools were necessary. The URL and the web browser were exciting 90s inventions. The internetworking of this decade was marked by social clashes and new combinations. Existing networks with particular social norms were joining together with other networks, all while more and more people bought computers and sought out connections. Online conversation grew explosively. One important network for social exchange in the 90s was Usenet. The history of Usenet actually begins in 1980, well before internetworking was a thing. Unlike the bulletin board systems of that era, where one person's computer functions as a storage for all files, as a bulletin board, Usenet was a decentralized network. All connected computers stored and sent all messages. Here's how that worked. A special program called a newsreader compared the files on your computer against the files of the computer you were connecting with. The newsreader then downloads and uploads files until the two file directories are identical. This network design meant that new messages spread slowly because it took time for every connected computer to compare and update its file directory. This decentralized architecture posed problems. The larger Usenet grew, as more computers joined, the more those computers would be overwhelmed by all the files they had to download and pass on. The solution was to opt in and out of different news groups. Instead of having to parse through all files, your computer only had to deal with new files if they were posted in specific topical news groups. Before internetworking, most news groups were technical and used by university students. Every year there was an influx of new users in September, when new students came to campus. These inexperienced users would quickly grow familiar with Usenet's cultural norms. Not cross-posting unnecessarily, only sending relevant messages, never sending too much, and so on. This culture was stable until the early 90s, when online services began offering Usenet access. In 1993, you no longer needed a special newsreader. You could just open America Online, the most popular online service of the time, and hop on Usenet. Once a company called Deja News made Usenet accessible through the web browser in 1995, Usenet grew even more. Veteran users lamented the change. They called it Eternal September. But over the course of the 1990s, as September stretched longer and longer, different newsgroups managed to build distinct subcultures. Some were oriented around debate, while others became supportive spaces, especially in newsgroups where people with stigmatized identities gathered and organized. Okay, so how can you work with Usenet as an archive? The answer involves Google. When Deja News died in the dot-com crisis, Google bought Usenet and tried to turn it into Google Groups. That never quite became a success. Google Groups claim to have archived all of Usenet, but in practice this archive is uneven and poorly maintained. Still, there is an enormous amount of online conversation to see, if you know how to navigate the mess. So, let's say I want to use Usenet to investigate Black responses to police violence in the 1990s. First, I use a newsgroup search engine to find relevant newsgroups. When I look for African American, I see many different groups. Newsgroups' names reflect the fact that they are part of hierarchies. If you opt into SOC, you opt into all newsgroups for social chat. If you opt into soc.culture, you opt into those social chat news groups that concern culture, and so on. Let's check out the largest one, soc.culture.african.american. Then I find this news group on Google Groups. Google Groups is completely overrun with spam, so recent messages are often very unpleasant to see. It's helpful to focus on a particular date range. For my search, I will zoom in on the period of the Rodney King uprisings. King was severely beaten by LAPD officers who were then acquitted at a 1992 trial. Large protests broke out in Los Angeles and elsewhere. So how were people talking about this at the time? My date range gives me results in chronological order. Let's click on this thread, announcing the verdict. Scrolling up to the first post gives a small timeline. A user expresses frustration and anger after hearing about the verdict. Another user, in LA, mentions that protests have begun. There's a long debate about the legitimacy of violence in protests. There's debates about looting. There's a user who mentions that they are reading and learning about institutional racism and the lack of investment in Black communities. And another who is hopeful that video cameras will help bring about justice in the future. These incomplete usernames and email addresses are typical of the Google Archive. In 1992, Usenet was still only accessible through specialized newsreaders, so these are mostly university students. It is very likely that many of them were alive for the repetition of these talking points on social media in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. Their writing on Usenet in 1992 reveals a deep continuity between online conversations then, this is well before most people had access to a web browser, and online conversations today. 1990s Usenet is a treasure trove. Trying out different news groups, different search terms, and different date ranges reveals an internet information, a past that already contains the future. And now that you know how to begin, you can start digging.